Okay, welcome to welcome to another episode of ADS Office Hours, in which the hero wonders how to get the most out of the ADS libraries. So first I'll do a short recap of how to access ADS libraries, and then I'll discuss a couple of use cases, like why using ADS libraries is actually a really nice idea. And then I'll give a couple of examples using the UI. And finally, you can also access the libraries with the API, and I'll give a couple of use cases where that could be interesting. So you can work with the new ADS without ever creating an account, and your search results will be just the same. So creating an account won't give you any better results. But if you do create an account, you'll get a lot of extra value, like being able to customize your experience, and ADS libraries is another example of a great enhancement of your experience of the new ADS. And you can either create libraries from search results or from the ADS libraries overview. But I'll show you the most convenient way of creating ADS libraries. Usually you do a query and you see either the complete result set or just a number of records that you think are very interesting and you want to keep those for future reference. Well, that's where the ADS libraries come in. In the red square, you have the option to create a new library if these are records that you want to put into a new library, or if you want to add them to a library that you've created before, then you can select that library from the drop-down list and add these records to that existing library. And once you've hit the submit button, in this case we're creating a new library, you'll have created a library with 4 records, and from the library view you can either work with these records with a number of options that are in the menu shown above the list of records, or if this happens to be a very large library and you want to explore the publications in a little bit more depth and be able to filter them, there is a button in the upper right that allows you to display these records in the search results page, where you'll have access to all the filters and additional data with much more information about the records. What people often do is they want to export a library in any given format, usually Biftec or Alias. And this convenient menu will allow you to, with one selection, to export the entire library in a certain format. And you're also able to use our visualization tools specifically with the contents of a library, which can also give you all kinds of relationships between the records that you otherwise would have a hard time figuring out with just the regular lists of results. By default, when you create a library is invisible to the rest of the world, but you can also make it public if for some reason you want to share these results, and I'll, a little bit further on, I'll give a couple of examples where this could be interesting or even useful. So why would you use ADS libraries? Well, first, the biggest application is bibliographies, and there's a wide range why bibliographies are interesting. It's often like your list of publications that you want to use in your resume or link from your resume to. You also may want to use it in your claiming in ORCID of your publications. You might want to link to your publications from your website. But there are also bigger applications, like an institute or an organization want to compile an institutional bibliography that they either want to work with or also display to the outside world, or on the level of a mission, an instrument. Maybe you want to follow which publications are generated from a certain grant. Maybe you want to create a bibliography of a certain, like a phenomenon or astronomical object, and just tag all the papers that have been published recently that mention or describe a certain object. Another big advantage is when you're writing a paper, which a lot of people do, not all people here, is you're writing a paper, and one of the things you have to do is compile your bibliography. So while you're doing research, finding papers that are relevant to the paper that you're writing, you can, over time, compile your bibliography in an Alias library. And when you're done, you just have to press the Biftec or the Alias button, and you've got your bibliography ready to copy and paste into your TeX or LaTeX manuscript. Maybe you want to compile a reading list, like you're browsing ADS, like with the latest archive SOPH records, or you're browsing, searching for your own field of interest, and you come across papers that you don't have time for to read like right now, but you want to read in your ample spare time when you're traveling or at home. So then those papers are always there when you log in. Or you want to create a reading list for a class that you're teaching, or a workshop, or a journal club for that matter. And a completely other application is you can even use ADS libraries as a data set, like people who do information science or informatics or bibliometrics. Then it's good to have a data set that's there, that doesn't change, and that you have complete curational control over. So when you have compiled a number of libraries over time, you may want to work with those libraries. Sometimes you compile libraries for different aspects of a mission, and in the end you want to create a library of the mission as a whole. So in ADS Classic we had ways of working with libraries by being able to subtract them or add them. So we created library set operations in the new ADS, which really extends the capabilities of ADS Classic, which allow you to effectively take unions or differences or intersections of libraries. And so when you're in the overview of all your libraries, there's an Actions button in the upper right, which brings you to a new menu where you can select a source and a secondary library, or even you can even create a union of as many libraries as you care to add together, or you can select intersection or difference. You can create a copy of a library, or you can decide that you need to empty a library that you have, which are actions like both copy and empty you could theoretically do from the regular contents view of a library, but that is quite a bit of work. And this, you can just do it in one fell swoop. And then you can specify the name of a library that will hold the results of your action. Another tool that I want to highlight in libraries is the so-called Citation Helper. Let's say you're writing a paper and you think, okay, I'm done, I've got the final version, and I've got my bibliography ready. But it may be a good moment to ask if you've really cited all the most important papers that you've cited. Like if you by accident forget to cite one of the more important papers of your thesis advisor, then that might reflect badly on you. So that's why we introduced the Citation Helper, which makes use of the fact that citations and papers form a network. And this network allows you to look at a set of papers and basically regard them in a sort of friends of friends network analysis. So if if all your friends, like if a large percentage of your friends happen to know one person that you don't know, then that person might be an interesting person for you to meet. So the same is with papers, that if all the papers in your final bibliography happen to be cited or cite a paper that isn't in your bibliography, that may be an interesting paper to consider, that maybe you need to include that in your bibliography. And that is expressed in a score that the citation helper generates. So if a score of 26 is pretty high, because that means that 26 of the 57 papers in your reference list are either cited or cite this particular paper, then you may wonder, that may be worth a second look if that paper happens to be important for what I'm describing. And finally, that's what I mentioned earlier, like when you're really done with your bibliography, then it's a trivial exercise to select Biftec or ASTec to export your reference list. And one feature that will roll out in a very near future is the option to create customizable Biftec keys. Like right now, it's by default always the bib code, and we've had quite a few questions that people would like to create a little bit more human readable Biftec key. And so that will be possible in the near future. You probably still need to be sure that they're unique across the Biftec file, but it might be just a small manual tweak. So you can also work with the Alias libraries using the API. And there were a number of examples where using the API is much more convenient than using the user interface, especially with big bibliographies. Like a good example is we have a huge bibliography here for SAO, but at the Smithsonian itself, they also want to know what the various parts of the Smithsonian publish. So they want to know which Smithsonian employees at SAO create which publications over time. And those are pretty enormous author lists, which is inconvenient to use the UI for. So that's a prime example why you would want to use the API, because then you can script all those queries. Another example is if you're more interested in following a certain research topic, especially over time, and see how publications about that topic change. So you can create a script and a set of queries that generate exactly the type of results that you're interested in, and generate libraries for a certain time period with publications, and then you study those data sets, and you can look for changes in topics, or so that's a great way of using the API. And another example is for when you do bibliometric research and you want to compile citation statistics and other types of metrics based on properties of publications. That is also very hard to do using the user interface. That's typically something you want to script, especially if you want to use machine learning and other types of tagging. So that's another great application of scripting and the API. And common operations in using the API for interacting with libraries is, you know, you have a library with a specific name, and you want to get the entire contents of that library, but including some basic metadata. You may also want to do set operations using the API by combining a number of libraries and use that result set to do any other additional work with. So I'll show you a couple of examples using curl, like how to interact with the library endpoint of our API. So we know that we have a library called Alias, and we want to work with the contents of that library. Well, this curl get command, and in this curl command you only need your API key. So that this will generate an overview of all the libraries that are associated with your account. And then you look in the result set for the library that you want to work with. In this case, it has the name ADS, and that will provide you with an important feature for the next step, because that will give you the library ID. In further steps, you will need the library ID to, for example, to get the actual contents of the library. So this is how you get the contents of that library. So you have the library ID in the URL, and the URL parameter FL you can use to specify the specific pieces of metadata that you want to have returned. So in this case, just to keep things simple, I just want to get the bib codes back from the records in the library and the titles. In our online help, we've got a complete overview of all the fields that our API knows about. But just for simplicity, we'll just use 2 fields here. And another important feature is to paginate, because it's much better to catch your information in smaller batches, especially when you're requesting a lot of metadata, which means that big chunks of data are shipped back from our API, and it works better if you do that in smaller chunks. So from the response, you know how many records there are in your library in this numFound parameter. So from the size of the number of records, in this case it's 25, the rows URL parameter tells you how many records you want to have back, send back in one query. So from that value and the number of records in the library, you can calculate how often you have to paginate. And this is an example of how you work with the set operations. So this is an example of, I want to create a union of 3 libraries, and I want to create a public library called mission. Let's say those 3 libraries are different aspects of a bibliography for a mission, like 3 different instruments or something. So you specify the library ID of one of the libraries in the URL, and the 2 others you specify in the library's parameter in the post body. This is a post request. And then in the post request, in the action parameter, you specify what type of action you want to do with these libraries. And there were other like optional parameters, like you can specify the name of the library that will be created. You don't have to. If you don't specify it, it will get a default name, but it makes sense just to keep things readable to create a library with a predictable name. The public parameter is optional as well. If you don't specify it, it will be a non-public, a private library. And you can also, if you add a description parameter, if you don't, that shows the example here shows what happens if you don't specify description. You get this big string saying basically what has been combined or what the action has done. But it probably makes more sense to give a human readable description. And that's what I wanted to tell you about libraries. Donna.
Could you review how I get an API token, please?
Oh, okay. So when you create an ADS account, maybe let's see.
If we go over here and then
If you go to the user interface, so basically when you create an account, you'll get an API key assigned automatically. So when you have an account and you're logged in, then this account drop-down list has a customized setting entry which has an API token. Do you want me to show your API key?
Oh, no, you're good.
So your API token is listed here in this menu item. And then you can do anything with the API that you want to do. Any other questions or any online questions?
Is there like a limit to the number of libraries you can have?
Good question, because I meant to tell you. So no, there's basically no limit whatsoever. So you can put as many records in a library as you wish, and you can create as many libraries as you wish. You can, so from a search results list, you can add at most 2,000 records in one go to a library. So if you want to create a library with 1 million records, that's a lot of selections of 2,000. But yeah, in principle, there's no limit to either the number of libraries or the number of records in the library. Yeah.
Do my classic libraries import automatically?
Yeah. So that's you can also do that from here. When you're logged in, there is an import libraries option where you can import libraries from any of the ADS Classic mirrors where you have an account. And then your entire library from ADS Classic will be imported into the new ADS, keeping the name. But if you happen to have nodes in ADS Classic library, those will not be visible in the new ADS. And we're still discussing internally what we want to do with the support of nodes in libraries.
So you could save a query, so you can regenerate, say, my version library over time. Is that? Can you save the query itself and just regenerate the library, or are you just only adding to it?
Well, we don't have the option yet to save queries just as queries, but we're working on that. Do you think that will be available soon?
Yeah,
Ish?
so it's going to be sort of part of my ADS re-implementation of the new system. To start with, we'll probably do whatever Classic has, but then going forward in the future, it's going to get rid of Biftec. So you'll be able to save more generic queries and put my ADS implementations to Classic. Probably for the next year, it depends on how quickly we get all the other.
Yeah, in the end, I never used the library function because it was always, like, for my own publications, always changing, so I always had to remake this as I was going forward. So, in some ways, that's more useful.
Yeah, for your own personal library too, you could consider using the working system, because it's sort of the saving and the query all in one go.
That could theoretically be an application for a script as well, using the API. Like if you know that if you query applications for your name, and there was no other person with your name, then you could create a script and add new records automatically through the API to your library.
Just easier just to rerun the query.
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.